Well, here we are. The college fantasy football playoffs are here. You're watching, listening to the CFF Sites Week 11 College Fantasy Football Show. I'm your host, Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF Site. And here we are, Week 11 for many of you guys. College fantasy football playoffs start this week. Action is already taking place with the MACtion games, always in the beginning of the week. I know it puts a lot of you guys just in pressure situations to make lineup judgments at the beginning of the week. But here we are. I'll start right there. Let's start with the MACtion games. You know, I know a lot of us college football fans in general, we wish we could see a game and watch a game every day of the week. But, you know, I just feel with college fantasy football, I don't particularly like the midweek games. And just for the reason that I mentioned, we have to make lineup decisions early. There's a lot of pressure. Playoffs are here. You're trying to weigh options. You're trying to weigh your, the players on your rosters and the matchups that they have. And you've got to make this Tuesday decision when most of your other players are going to go on, Thursday, or most of them are going to go on Saturday. For that reason, I don't like the MAC games at the beginning of the week. It's just college fantasy football playoff time. I want to have as much time to kind of look at my roster as possible. I know you guys that play in Power 5 only leagues, this doesn't apply to you guys, but for everyone in full FBS formats, it certainly does. And so it puts a lot of pressure to make an early week decision. We had the projections up there. But like I mentioned, beginning of the week with the MAC games, you've got questions on injured players. Are they going to play this week? Are they not going to play? You're looking at that, evaluating your roster. And for that reason, I just don't like the MAC games during college fantasy football playoff weeks. I wish we could just go Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and forget about the Tuesday, Wednesday. I love watching college football. I can watch it every day. But for the reason that I just mentioned, that's why I don't like the MACtion games in the beginning of the week. I like to have as much time to analyze rosters, give guys feedback as much as possible. Mike does a great job at getting those DFS write-ups out. He's got the Thursday slate. We already got it up on the site. I'm recording this again on a Wednesday night, trying to give you guys the most time, possible to listen to this podcast before the weekend, because we're in week 11. I'm not going through game by game anymore. There's a few matchups that I'm going to touch on, some players that I'm going to throw out that maybe we haven't mentioned up until this point all year, may be able to help some guys out. We don't really have many bye week dilemmas. I think there's only two teams on a bye this week, maybe BYU and UTEP. So for the most part, we've got a full schedule from here on out. I think, two, maybe three teams on a bye next week, maybe one team on a bye the final week. Buys are not going to play a factor anymore. Injuries will, and we know that injuries are just part of college fantasy football. We live with it and talk about it week after week after week, season after season after season. And so it's just part of the game. We've got the auto sub feature that Fantrax, and look, it's not perfect, but they're trying to do as much as they can to help us out in the college fantasy football world. But I know a lot of you guys are already in full FBS leagues, getting week 11 underway. And for me, week 12 is the most important week, the second to last week, the semifinal week of college fantasy football playoffs, to me is the single biggest week in the college fantasy football schedule. And I say it every year just for the reasons that most of you guys are that play in leagues, play in money leagues. And whether or not you award money to fourth or third, that's up in the air. I don't know that. But the one thing that I do know is that most money leagues have first and second place. And so if you win that semifinal matchup, you're guaranteed a payday. And so for that reason, I say, for you guys that have buys this week, that have done well, maybe you're in a 6-team playoff format, and you've got a bye, you should be doing everything you can to get that roster ready for your matchup next week, that semifinal week. And I say this to anybody that even is playing this week and comes out victorious this week going into next week. It's all hands on deck. Throw everything into week 12, because week 13, look, week 12, you win that matchup. you're guaranteed first or second place. And then from there, look, there's a lot of guys, you make it the first and second. You may even split the pot. It may be 50-50, split it 60-40. I don't know how you guys divide your winnings. And you're playing for pride. You're playing for the bragging rights, maybe the trophy of your league, or who's going to lift the plaque or have their name engraved on the plaque, right? But a lot of you guys play, and it's all about the money. And I say it every year. Semifinal week is the week you throw everything, you throw caution to the wind. It's all about getting to the finals because you're guaranteed first or second place prize money. And that's why I always consider the second to last week of the college fantasy football season, the semifinal week of playoffs, the single most important week in the college fantasy football, on the college fantasy football schedule. So that's my 2 cents on the MAC games. That's how I feel about the schedule moving forward. And look, before we go on any farther, I just, last week, trying to get all the content out. And the projections are up already. So all of you guys that are watching this are probably taking a peek at the projections already. Want to give a shout out to the guys in the 4-in-1 super fantasy leagues. I haven't really had a chance to really dig into and dive into the results of some of those leagues now for a couple of weeks. So I really want to slow down. We're closing in on the final weeks of the season, and just want to give some shout outs to the guys that are really doing well this year, sitting at the top. So let's go through it real quick. Let's just kind of give some shout outs right here. So let's look at the 4-in-1 super fantasy league total points format. Team that accumulates that totals the most points over the course of the season, over the course of 13 weeks, will be the total points format champion. And right now, the top 5 going into the last 3 weeks of the season, sitting at the top, Blackbeard's Delight, who I know is a defending champion. He's done really well. He's a guy that comes back every year and does really well. At Tommy Mac, sitting in second place going into this week. Sooner Cub, 21, sitting in third. Legenbaz at 4th, and sitting in 5th is Left Coast. Now, some of those names may sound familiar, because let's get into some of the individual tournaments, and let's just revisit the 2-halves tournament. We know we've got friend of the show, Andrew P. Katz, sitting in the championship matchup spot, but there are 4 teams left in that tournament, in the second half tournament, and Sooner Cub 21, there's that name again, going up against Mountaineers 5 in a semifinal match. He will play the winner of Legenbaz, again, another name we're familiar with that I mentioned that's in the total point standings in the top 5. He's going to play Market Zero in the semifinal match. The winner of those 2 games will meet up to determine who the second half champion will be, and they will play Andrew P. Katz in the 2-halves tournament championship in week 13. Moving over to the head-to-head tournament, week 10 and 11 is a 2-week matchup. We're into the semifinals. You're going to play most points over the course of 2 weeks. Chip and Teddy is playing Blackjacks. Right now, Blackjacks is sitting on about a 20-point lead going into week 11. And in the other semifinal matchup, Blackbeard's Delight going up against Tri-Spoke. Blackbeard's Delight with about a 32-point lead going into this week. So what's really interesting is that Blackbeard's Delight last week, or the week before, knocked out Sooner Cub. I mentioned Sooner Cub 21 was in the semifinals of the 2-halves tournament. He actually knocked out Blackbeard's Delight this past week to move into the semifinals. So Blackbeard's Delight knocks off Sooner Cub in the head-to-head format. Sooner Cub 21 takes care of Blackbeard's Delight in the 2-halves tournament. That's what I love about these formats. There are so many different formats, so many teams advancing. Those guys actually matched up against one another in 2 different tournaments and took one another out. So they both advanced, both of those guys sitting in the top 5. And of course, the eliminator, we are down to the top 16 teams. I'm going to go ahead and rattle them off just to give you guys props for making it this far. The top 10 this week will advance. Here's the rundown of the 16 teams still alive. Addy B, 17. Blackjacks, we've heard that name already. C Money Bobby, 44. Cough Bulls, Donkeys, Iron City Renegades, Jay Saltman, 14. Left Coast, heard that name again. Market Zero, another familiar name. Mountaineers, 5 again. P. Faustian, Prozac Pups, Silver Bullets, Tri-Spoke, a name we've heard before, and of course, Blackbeard's Delight and Sooner Cub 21. Blackbeard's Delight, Sooner Cub 21. Both of those guys in the top running to potentially win multiple tournaments, multiple formats in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League. So that's sort of the shout out to all the guys in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League. It's been another good season. Like I said, I wish I had more time to dedicate promoting this league with all the weekly content that we've got to do. I know sometimes I fall behind on that. So shout out to all of you guys. Have some ideas moving into next year to kind of help those guys that get stuck with, roster lockouts and whatnot. Got some ideas moving into going into next year. But the format, I think, will still sort of stay the same. Predominantly most of the rules will be intact, but I'm thinking about making a few tweaks to make it a little easier for some of you guys to kind of keep up. So let's get into some of the weekly games. We'll go conference by conference. I'll start group of 5 when we get over into the Power 5. This week, we will end with the Big 12 conference. Big showdown in the Big 12. Texas playing TCU. I've got been on a nice little run here with these games. I've got a hot take for TCU. You'll have to stay around to see how that goes, but we're going to end it with Texas and TCU. So let's just start first in the group of 5 conferences. We're going to start in the American Conference. And yes, there's a lot of, whether we go with Davis Brin at Tulsa, there's a lot of players that are questionable. Brandon Campbell, you're going to go into this week with some of these guys. They never played last week. And are they going to play this week? What's Central Florida going to do at quarterback? Are they going to go with Plumlee? Are they going to go with Keene? Right now, I don't think you could take a risk on either of those guys right now. Just a tough call. And I think as far as matchups go in the American Conference, there's nothing that really stands out that's out of the ordinary. I think what we see is what we're going to get in that conference. You've got a hot Houston offense, right? You've got SMU as well coming off with another great matchup. I think Tajay Spears for Tulane this week is, I think a lot of fantasy owners will really be turning to him in their starting lineups this week. Touchdown in 3 straight games in a Tulane offense that's playing really well. They get Central Florida at home, so I would expect to see a heavy dose there. When you look at that Navy matchup, they're playing Notre Dame, so I'll knock out Notre Dame here. Audric Esteem looks to be back in favor over in Notre Dame now after that fumbling issue, back-to-back 100-yard game, so you've got to feel good about that matchup against Navy. And so the other thing that I'll mention, and really this could be Seth Hennigan for me was kind of on the border of trying to get him. I was trying to get him into my top 20 player rankings this week. I know he came out he projected well in the weekly player projections. That Tulsa offense struggles against the run, and I'm wondering if he can do some damage with his legs in that Memphis offense. Maybe a name to consider if you're going to go deep for a quarterback in the full FBS leagues. Let's go over to Conference USA. And again, one matchup that just sticks out to me over in Conference USA because it's around UTSA, where they lost to Corian Clark. And I know that's a major hit for some of you guys out there. I mean, he was pretty consistent, 7 catches, 90 yards. Almost a touchdown, maybe, every 2 out of every 3 weeks. That's a big loss for that UTSA offense. Let's give you some other points to consider this week. Oscar Cardenas, the tight end, I think he kind of slides into maybe more of a wide receiver 3 role in that offense. If anything, it looked like last week that maybe he'll get a few more looks now with the Corian Clark out. But here's one thing to be aware of in this matchup with UTSA playing Louisiana Tech. For as good as it looks on paper for Frank Harris in that UTSA passing game, it looks just as good on paper for that UTSA running game. Louisiana Tech is giving up 235 yards per game on the ground. Don't overlook Kavorian Barnes and maybe Brendan Brady in this matchup for you guys that are sitting there with them on your roster. Maybe you're battling injuries. Those are a couple of names to consider in this all-important Week 11 schedule, knowing that the Roadrunners are facing one of the worst, maybe, let me check it out. That may be the worst rush defense in all of college football. And that is correct. 234 yards per game is worst in the FBS. Kavorian Barnes, Brendan Brady, keep an eye on those guys for UTSA this weekend. Skipping over to the independents, and I know I touched on Notre Dame already, but I think one game that we need to be aware of if you're looking at a player that you're not normally or you haven't normally turned to all year, we've got to look at that Liberty at Connecticut matchup. Liberty coming off that big win at Arkansas last week. There's a chance that Dede Hunter, running back for Liberty, doesn't play. There's a chance that he may not be back for this game. And if he isn't, I almost feel Shadro Louis is an auto play in that Liberty offense. I think you've got to get him in. I've got him in my top 20 running back rankings this week under the assumption that Dede Hunter will not play. If he does, I think you're looking at split carries. I wouldn't call him a bad option at that point. But if Hunter's out, Shadro Louis could be a huge difference maker for some of you guys in full FBS formats this week. And then we cannot overlook, because Jonathan Bennett's playing real well at quarterback, you cannot overlook Demario Douglas. He's got 7 or more receptions now in 3 straight games, and this matchup at Connecticut could be another one of those production games for Demario Douglas. So a couple of names for you guys not to sleep on this week on the independents, and that's Shadro Louis, running back Liberty, along with teammate Demario Davis at the receiver spot. Let's hop on over to the Mountain West Conference. Again, injuries are going to take place here. You've got Utah State playing at Hawaii. Calvin Tyler, will he play? There's a chance that he may not play. Hawaii, that's who they're playing this week. They're giving up 230 yards per game on the ground. That's 3rd worst in the FBS. Mike did a great job of putting Robert Briggs, running back Utah State, on his waiver wire report last week. I hope you guys took him up on it, because if Calvin Tyler is out, Robert Briggs could be a difference maker at running back for you guys that were able to snag him off of the waiver wire. He had 19 carries for 82 yards against New Mexico last week. And you would have to think that they'll feed him the ball this week against that terrible Hawaii rushing defense this week. So don't overlook Robert Briggs if Calvin Tyler is not in the lineup this week. And then I think we have to look at that Fresno State UNLV matchup as well. Jake Haener has played exceptional since he's been back from injury, but also let's not overlook the running backs on both sides of the football in this matchup. Fresno State, they're giving up 162 yards per game on the ground. UNLV giving up 161 yards per game on the ground. That's good news if you're fantasy owners of Aiden Robbins of UNLV and Jordan Mims of Fresno State. Should still see some production on the ground from both of those guys in that Mountain West matchup. Let's hop on over to the Sun Belt. We'll kind of finish some things up in the group of 5 conferences. James Madison, Old Dominion. Why do I bring this game up? You've had 2 ho-hum weeks from receivers, Chris Thornton of James Madison, Ali Jennings of Old Dominion. Here's my philosophy. I know Thornton was kind of, they played Louisville. You got to worry about a little bit of bad weather. ODU played some decent defenses. Remember, James Madison's strong suit on defense is against the run. I think ODU will be able to throw the ball, and I think James Madison will be able to throw the ball a bit on ODU. Why do I say this? Well, I know they've struggled, and sometimes as a fantasy owner, you're sitting there like playoff time. Do I really want to take a chance with these guys? And here's what I'll say, particularly after they've had a couple of down weeks. Sometimes you got to roll with the guys that get you there. And Chris Thornton has been so good, and Ali Jennings has been so good over the course of the year. You really don't want to take a chance on missing out on those high ceiling gains if they happen to have it this week. Sometimes you got to roll, and if I'm going down, I'm going to go down with the guys that have gotten me there. And so for that reason, Chris Thornton, Ali Jennings, I think you've got to get them in the lineup this week. Let's talk about a new name that kind of came up on the radar. And this was a guy that I threw up. I didn't have him in my top 20 rankings. I went back and looked at him again, and I said, I've got to make an adjustment. I had to get him in there. I took Thayer Thomas out of that 20 spot. Tyrone Howell, Louisiana Monroe, is in my top 20 this week. I think he could be a difference maker for a lineup this week. Let's look at him over the last couple of weeks. Against Texas State last week, caught 12 passes, 176 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Week before that, he only had 5 catches for 24 yards against Army. But if we look at the 2 games before that, against South Alabama, decent defense, caught 9 passes for 244 yards and 3 touchdowns. The week before that, 4 passes for 77 yards and a touchdown against Coastal Carolina. Those aren't bad Sun Belt opponents. Tyrone Howell, they'll find a way to get him the ball. ULM playing at Georgia State this week. Georgia State, big win last week. They're trying to become bowl eligible. They get a home game against ULM this week, but Georgia State is still giving up 222 passing yards per game. That's good news if you were able to scoop up Tyrone Howell, and I think you've got to take a chance with him. That ceiling, the numbers that he's been able to produce over the last month, too good to pass on, particularly at playoff time. Appalachian State playing at Marshall. Running back Kalen LeBourne last week, the first week of the season, he did not score a touchdown. I'm not expecting him to go back-to-back weeks without a score. There was a lot of questions coming in to me the week before, last week, about Coastal Carolina, really about going up against that Appalachian State defense. Appalachian State has played 2 FCS schools. A lot of their defensive stats have been skewed by some of the matchups that they've played. I don't think Appalachian State's defense is that great. I think Kalen LeBourne will be able to get his 100 yards and minimum 1 touchdown in this matchup, and I think he's a must-start this week. LaDamian Webb, 409 yards, 7 touchdowns in the last 2 games. Boy, he's hot and healthy at the right time. There's no way you're sitting that guy. And then, of course, a matchup, Coastal Carolina at USM. That is going to affect a bunch of lineups because we've learned that Grayson McCall will miss 3 to 6 weeks with a foot injury. Now, here's my take on this. Coastal, the running game has been easy to avoid this year. The running backs, we just don't know what we're going to get. But Grayson McCall has been steady, and so has receiver Jared Brown. And now that McCall's out, I know there's many of you guys that are probably contemplating whether or not Jared Brown is a start this week. Here's my thoughts. Evaluate your roster, see what you have ahead of Brown. But the one thing that I can tell you is that Coastal's going to do what they can to get the guy touches. Last week, he scored a rushing touchdown in that option offense. They're probably going to find ways to get him the ball again. I have no problem, even without Grayson McCall, getting Jared Brown in that offense, because now he probably becomes the most dangerous player on the offensive side of the ball in that Coastal Carolina offense. And so I do think you've got to get him in the lineup this week. Now, that's going to do it for the Group of 5 matchups. Let's go ahead and get right into the Power 5 matchups. We're going to start in the ACC. Azrael Abanaconda, we've got to get him in the roster this week. It looks like he was close to playing last week. He didn't. I know some of you guys were burned. He should be back this week. Hopefully another big game from him. He's high up in the rankings and the projections as well. Louisville playing at Clemson. Not great news if you have quarterback Malik Cunningham, who has been solid all year. This is just a case of not the best matchup at a bad time for you guys. Malik Cunningham, I think, maybe first week outside of the top 20 rankings for me. Not saying that he cannot do it, but that matchup against Clemson is just a tough matchup this week. Boston College playing at North Carolina State. I mentioned it when I was talking about getting Tyrone Howell into my top 20 player rankings. Thayer Thomas, I think, was the guy that I bumped out. That was a really tough decision to make. Thayer Thomas, 8 receptions in 3 of the last 4 games. And so at the beginning of the year, didn't look promising if you had Thayer Thomas. I would imagine there's a lot of fantasy owners that probably dropped him, maybe gone back at the end of the year and picked him up, or there's another owner sitting on him. 8 receptions in 3 of the last 4 games, and I think he's a start this week in that matchup at home against Boston College. And then, boy, this one could be fun. North Carolina at Wake Forest, and I know a lot of you guys were burned by Sam Hartman in that matchup against Louisville a couple of weeks ago, but here we are. Drake May, Sam Hartman in what could be a dream matchup for fantasy, fantasy wise, if you have Drake May, if you have that North Carolina offense, Josh Downs, Wake Forest, Sam Hartman, A.T. Perry. This is a matchup where you look at it and you say, this is the matchup we need. This is the matchup that could produce that 45-42 game. That this game could be a tipping point in your weekly results in college fantasy football this week. And then on the flip side of that, we've got Syracuse playing Florida State. Garrett Schrader, we don't know if we're going to get him. I'm not anticipating him to play, at least as of Tuesday. That's not so great news for Sean Tucker now, because that Florida State defense can really just buckle their chin straps and concentrate on the playmaker, Sean Tucker. And so this could be a tough week for you Sean Tucker owners, and I think you've really got to take a chance. This is, I've already said it earlier in the show, you've got to go down with the guys that got you there, and Sean Tucker he's been one of those guys this year. But when the offense loses a key cog in its offense, like a Garrett Schrader, you've got to weigh your options now going into this matchup with Sean Tucker. And I'm not saying that I would bench him, but I would certainly weigh all my options before sticking him in as a starter. Couple of notes over in the Big Ten, I think real quickly, Wisconsin and Iowa, just when Caleb Johnson, he has that, 200-yard touchdown, 200 yards and a touchdown against Purdue. All of a sudden they play a decent Wisconsin defense. And then all of a sudden you've got Wisconsin and Braylon Allen, where they're going to run the ball. They're going up against that tough Iowa defense. And boy, if you've got Caleb Johnson and Braylon Allen, this is just a bad matchup at a bad time. But those guys are going to get touches. They're going to get carries. Could be 100-yard and a touchdown game for each one of those guys. But, had they not been playing one another and playing another team in the Big Ten, you could have been looking at a 150-yard, 2-touchdown game, possibly, at least for Braylon Allen. And we all know that Iowa offense has had trouble this year. And you just wonder if that game against Purdue was the switch that flicks on that Iowa running game and Caleb Johnson takes it to another level. If anything, hopeful looking forward to next year with Caleb Johnson. And then real quick, we can't go on without mentioning the Ohio State running back position, because this was something that I mentioned several weeks ago, that when one guy is out, it's great to have the other running back. If Henderson's out, it's great to have Williams. If Williams is out, it's great to have Henderson. They do eat into one another's fantasy value when they are both healthy. Whether or not Trevion Henderson plays this week still remains to be seen. If he doesn't, Mayan Williams is definitely a must start. And I just feel with the way that Mayan Williams gets in the end zone, he's probably a must start for most of you guys. But he could have a really big game depending on the availability of Trevion Henderson, something that we have to keep an eye on. Let's get over into the Pac-12, and here's an ultimate dilemma for a lot of you guys sitting on Mario Williams and Jordan Addison receivers over at USC. We've gone multiple weeks now with both players not dressing. You've got USC, the only fortunate part about USC, and I'll mention this about their game, and this is why I want to bring it up. After you go a couple of weeks and your guy doesn't play, you have to really worry, and I would be concerned about starting either guy this week because, one, they play Colorado. First of all, they're in the running to make the college football playoffs. We know they don't need them at home against Colorado. So maybe even if they do play, are they going to be on some type of a snap count? One, that's what I'd be worried about. Two, it's just never a sure thing, right? You've gone a couple of weeks. Do you start him? Do you start either guy? But here's the good part. And here's the one good thing about USC playing Colorado. It's a Friday night game that a lot of us are going to be watching. And there's a good chance that we're going to get news early on whether or not how each guy looks in warmups. And I say this all the time, all year. Sometimes we don't even get news till within about 30, 40 minutes of kickoff. And you kind of get an idea if the guys are running with the ones in pregame on whether or not they're going to start. I'm just still concerned that we may see some of that in pregame because I'm really concerned. I just don't see where USC is going to, or where they're going to need Jordan Addison and Mario Williams this week. So that's the caution flag that I'm putting up in this matchup, because here's the deal. Colorado, they're allowing 232 yards per game on the ground. Travis Dye is the one that you want in this matchup. He's going to be a top play this week. He's one of the top projected running backs in Week 11, should have a big game and carry that USC offense. Between Caleb Williams and Travis Dye, big game this week for those two guys. Washington State this week. The reason why I'm bringing up Washington State, they're hosting Arizona State. Nakia Watson returned, ran for 166 yards and a touchdown on 16 carries versus Stanford. They get Arizona State this week, and the Sun Devils are allowing almost 180 yards per game on the ground. Nakia Watson, been off the radar for, the last few weeks. All of a sudden now could be a difference maker for some of you guys in the college fantasy football playoffs. Washington at Oregon, Bo Nix, Drake May battling it out to see who's going to be the top scoring fantasy quarterback this year. But here's one thing to keep in mind. I don't think Michael Penix is in that Washington passing game. I don't think they're a bad play this week. Oregon is allowing 276 yards per game in the air. That's good news. Sometimes college football, it's all about matchups. And I think Oregon they're going to give up some points and they're going to give up some yards. I almost feel like 300 yards in a big game from that Washington passing game. They may not be able to match Oregon on the scoreboard, but you want them to be able to put up some points, particularly if you have some of those Oregon players. You want Bo Nix to stay on the field longer. Oregon really hasn't shut down anybody this year. And like I said, they're allowing 276 yards per game in the air. And so I do think that that's good news if you have Michael Penix or, Odunze, Millen over at Washington. If you've got some of those receivers, I think they're okay to play too. And then Arizona at UCLA, very similar situation. UCLA allowing 248 yards per game in the air. So I think there are worse plays this week than Jaden Delora, quarterback of Arizona. I would not be afraid to throw him into that matchup against UCLA that's given up almost 250 yards per game in the air. Now, let's head on over to the SEC before we finish it up with the Big 12, Missouri at Tennessee. Why do I bring up this matchup? Well, Jabari Small, running back, Tennessee, he sustained a shoulder injury last week. Still don't have an update on his status going into this weekend's game against Missouri. But if Jabari Small isn't able to go, I really believe that Jalen Wright can be a big difference maker in college fantasy football this week. Another matchup where we have to monitor the injury situation. I prefer to have Jabari Small over Jalen Wright, but if Jabari Small doesn't play, Jalen Wright becomes a must start, in my opinion. Arkansas playing at LSU. Will LSU have, will they come down off of that high? Will they trip up on the road at Arkansas? I'm not so sure. Jaden Daniels, probably as highly projected and as high in my rankings as he's been at any time this year. And the one thing to keep in mind, I know he's doing damage with his legs. He will continue to do so. Look what Liberty did to Arkansas last week. And let's not overlook the fact that Arkansas has the third worst passing defense in all of college football. They're allowing 302 yards per game in the air. That's good news if you have LSU quarterback Jaden Daniels, who's a must start this week. South Carolina should get back Marshawn Lloyd this week. So if you have Marshawn Lloyd, he should be back in the lineup this week. And then I don't want to go through the SEC without mentioning Georgia at Mississippi State. If you have access to the notes and observations I posted earlier this week, you know the difference. What Will Rogers has done at home and on the road, and home in SEC games and on the road in SEC games. It's not even close. He's a different quarterback at home. Way different quarterback. However, wrong place, wrong time this week. Are you willing to take that risk on Will Rogers against that Georgia defense in Week 11? That's one I'd really consider. I have to tell you, that's one that you guys are going to have to take a hard look at, because for me, that's a pass. And I know Will Rogers has been incredible at home, and Mississippi State's offense has been incredible at home. They've been a completely different team on the road, and I'm just wondering if this is the game right here that just breaks that trend I do not feel good about Will Rogers at home against Georgia. And then Texas A&M at Auburn. Let's not get through the SEC without mentioning this matchup, and here's why. You got Devin Achane on one side of the football, Tank Bigsby, who's been playing well on the other side of the football. Devin Achane, Texas A&M's defense, they're giving up 215 yards per game on the ground. But let me make sure that that's accurate first, because this is a really good stat for both of these guys if you're holding on to them. So here we go. Texas A&M, they're giving up 215 yards per game on the ground rushing. Great news if you have Tank Bigsby. I know a lot of you guys have been a little hesitant on starting Bigsby over the last few weeks because he started off hot, then he went cold, but he's been on a nice run lately. Faces a Texas A&M defense at home and Texas A&M defense is allowing 215 yards per game on the ground. Now, on the flip side of that, Devin Achane has been solid all year. I know the game's at Auburn, but that Auburn run defense is giving up 191 yards per game on the ground. Devin Achane, Tank Bigsby should be in your lineups this week. Let's get on over to the Big 12. I'll end with TCU, Texas last. Oklahoma State, will they get Spencer Sanders back? I'm not optimistic on that. Cartavius Norton, running back, Iowa State. Is this now his show? Is he the running back one? Will he stick? Let's see if they run him out there to finish out the year in that running back one spot. Solid game last week. What is Texas Tech going to do at quarterback without Baron Morton? My thinking is I think they're going to turn it over to Tyler Shugg. I'm not particularly sure we're going to see both guys unless Shugg struggles. But let's get into TCU at Texas. And here's my take on the game. Here's my take on TCU and that Texas matchup. I think TCU's been very solid. The offense has looked really good up until this year. I know Quentin Johnston's kind of bothered by a little bit of a nagging injury. But here's my I mentioned at the top of the show, I had a hot take on TCU. I believe that TCU could possibly lose their final 3 games of the year. They go to Texas, they travel to Baylor, and then they end with Iowa State. And while Iowa State hasn't looked good this year, the one thing to keep in mind is Iowa State is sitting at 4-5. They play at Oklahoma State this week. They get Texas Tech at home, and then they go to TCU. And here's why I think TCU could be in trouble. I think they lose this weekend at Texas. I think Texas beats TCU. I think TCU is going to have a hard time going to Baylor and win. And if Iowa State is sitting on a 5th win going into that season finale, that regular season finale against TCU on a 5th win, one more win makes them bowl eligible, Iowa State will be ready to play. There is a possibility that TCU could go from 9-0 to 9-3 and not even play in the Big 12 championship game. It's a possibility. Will it happen? I don't know. I hope it does. And I'd like to see all you guys that are holding on to TCU, that have TCU players that have carried you guys all year long. I think they'll continue to score. But I do think Texas trips them up this week. And if they do, you worry about if there's a hangover effect and whether or not they can get past Baylor the final week, who will still hopefully be in the running for the Big 12 title as well. And then Iowa State could finish strong and possibly go to a bowl game. So dangerous waters if you're a TCU fan. I think you've been very fortunate up until this point. I think the run comes to an end this weekend, but my hot take is TCU could go from 9-0 to finishing 9-3. That's going to do it for the Week 11 show. So we talked about everything. A lot of names to throw out there, a lot to digest. I know you could see that, there's a little bit of extra in my voice this week. It's playoff week here. There's a little extra excitement every time we get to this part of the year. I'm just ready to get into the games, ready to watch it, ready to see who's going to bust out, who's going to win games for players. Unfortunately, who's going to cost players some fantasy matchups. Anxious to get the emails on roster questions this week. Anxious to get the emails at the end of the week for guys that tell me that they won their matchup by just a few points or lost by a few points here or there, and it was the one move here and there that made the difference for them. Although everybody in contention in the 4-1 Super Fantasy Leagues, good luck. We should have some information coming up with the bowl season coming up. I'm going to try to get some bowl season leagues. Stay in tune for that. We'll have some details on that information. Mike will have all the DFS write-ups Friday, Saturday night, all coming. Projections are live, but that's going to do it for the Week 11 show, guys. College fantasy football playoffs are here. Good luck to everyone that is still alive, still playing, still in the running to win their league. I'll see you guys in Week 12 next week, semifinal week. Good luck to everyone. Till then, guys.